someone's manager, supervisor, or boss, one of the things that's very different is that you need to engage in insightful learning in order to really adequately influence others or manage one other person, let alone, a team. So this is why insightful learning in this quadrant is so important. There are 5 elements of insightful learning and gaining insight and being the very best manager, very best supervisor or boss. Some of you might recognize this book, Start With Why. Senior leadership team was asked to read that book. The author is Simon Sinek, who you will see in a video this afternoon. And if you first develop self-insight, one of the things you might want to start with is why. Why do I behave the way that I do? Why do I make the decisions that I do? Why do I have the style that I have? And if you are curious about those questions, one thing I would recommend is taking an assessment. It could be a personality assessment. There's thousands of them available, depending on what you're curious about. And some of you might be familiar, for example, the most widely known assessment is the Myers-Briggs Typology Index. It's not the most reliable or valid. However, it's the most widely known. It's given to people about 5 to 7 million times a year. And one of the reasons that it's gotten such a good ground hold is because it speaks the language that people understand. Introvert, extrovert, sensing, intuitive. It's become kind of the lingo or fabric of personality inventories. But there are so many out there if you're curious. You might also be curious about your own style. Are you a logical person? Are you someone who is more visual, verbal? That can relate to learning style and also to management style as well. Have you been curious about your strengths? What are your key strengths and what are your key development areas? By the way, people are usually better off leveraging their strengths most of the time instead of focusing on solely their weaknesses, challenges, and development areas. So here's some ways in which you can develop self-insight. Any questions about assessments or curiosities, please reach out and let us know, let me know. Another way to gain insight and levels of self-awareness is to get feedback from other people, ideally from your team. Most people, when they think of feedback, they think of their own boss or supervisor, and they say, oh, I wonder how I'm doing, and they think about their boss. But if you're somebody's manager or supervisor, you can a lot of times get the most valuable feedback from your team and asking yourself, gee, how am I doing? And asking the team. So it can be tough to reach out for feedback. In fact, Harvard Business Review wrote an entire book called The Fear of Feedback. So if you don't feel quite ready, you can jump into articles and books and information like that. What happens, what should you do if you're not receiving feedback? What should you do? What do you think?
Ask for it.
Ask for it, yay, yes, that's what the question mark up there is for. Ask for it, which can be a tough exercise, like I mentioned before, but it's an important thing to do. Margaret usually gives the example of saying, she worked for 3M Corporation for many years in sales, and she'd ask her supervisor after he shadowed her sales call, so how am I doing? How did it go? And he'd say, you're doing great, just keep doing what you're doing. And she said, that feels good to hear, but it's not enough. And she said she realized she had to ask very specific questions. How could I have said that better to close the sale? What do other people do that I could start doing that you think would make me more effective? So when you ask those questions, ask specific questions and you'll get specific, more pointed answers for feedback. When you get that feedback, be sure to listen. Do this one-to-one, so you're meeting with team members. Make sure that even if it's difficult information to hear, that you really are focused on wanting to make sure you utilize that information for change. I mentioned before, leverage your strengths, which means you have to know what your strengths are, but don't overutilize them. So strengths can also become deficits if you overuse them too much, So use them to the amount that is a good fit for your role and for the organization. We may all know people who are great with others, extroverted, but they overutilize their strength and overspeak at a meeting or something like that. That's an example of overusing a strength. Be brave, test yourself a little bit, stretch yourself when it comes to leveraging and utilizing your strengths. Learn more, and make sure that every single person on the team gets to use and demonstrate and show their strengths as well. Gaining improvements. Gaining improvements is not about you and your team only. It's also about gaining improvements for the business, because you and your team are responsible for specific results for Sun Country Airlines. So utilize not only your knowledge and experience, but the knowledge and experience of your entire team. Connect those dots to what you are being asked to do for Sun Country Airlines. Then everyone working together creates that kind of upward shift and draft for wins, for the gains you're supposed to be making. Make sure to utilize the tools that are available to you. SYI is the main communication point, and a lot of managers, supervisors, and even senior leadership team members don't really utilize all of the tools that are available on SYI. We're getting there, but we hope to people do this more. And then focus on consistency. So once you gain a win, don't say, okay, my job is done. Make sure that you're doing that and replicating that and honing that over and over and over again for consistently great results. Demonstrating sound judgment is a very important piece of this quadrant. So making sure, especially if you're a boss, supervisor, or manager, that you are just and fair. We're going to talk about a little bit about just culture this afternoon in the decisions you make. Go right up to that risk point. This is part of being brave, but demonstrate sound judgment and know when you need to take a step back when something is too risky. But go up to that edge. Make sure to think about the ethical implications of what you're doing. Interesting, there's a documentary, it's available on Netflix, called Dishonesty. And one of the most important things about that documentary, if you care to watch it, is that people who ended up in ethical situations didn't realize at the time that they were making an ethical decision. They were simply making decisions based on their own motives and values. And they had no idea what the future consequences were going to be, because they were not thinking of it as an ethical judgment or decision. A manager or supervisor should be thinking about that. And once you do that, everyone wins. So everyone can get to the end goal and to those goals that we all want to achieve. You know, across the country, the best, most renowned business schools in the world have tools for self-insight and self-awareness embedded into their MBA program. So, you know, I know for some people who are looking at insightful learning and self-awareness and self-insight, this stuff sounds mushy and like, ugh, feelings, and ugh, you know, testing, and oy, that just doesn't sound good at all. But research says over and over and over again that people who engage in exercises related to gaining self-insight and raising their level of self-awareness are the very best leaders. So much so that this is embedded in what a lot of the best business schools in the world ask their students to do. So now we're going to do an exercise about your own level of self-awareness and insight as a manager or supervisor.
So if you could take a look in your book, there